So let's get started. You've almost made it. So last week, one more lecture, one more round of toots. And today, we're going to talk exclusively about cognitive illusions and cognitive biases. So I'm going to give you all the reasons why you've been struggling so much and why it's so difficult to be a good, successful critical thinker. But I think there might also be hope. We'll see. In the tutorials, we're going to be looking at a version of a sample exam. So highly recommended. I'm not going to be messing you up with cognitive illusions, but it's really going to be exam preparation. So be sure that you come to that. Aside from that, any other questions that we should clarify now before we get started? Good. So very quick review. We looked last time at a number of informal fallacies, and the first group of types of fallacies that we looked at were all fallacies of relevance or fallacies of irrelevance. These are all types of fallacies that basically try to distract attention from the actual argument by changing the topic in one way or another. So the red herring is a general way of doing that, right? Just distracting with some completely irrelevant fact from the actual matter. This might be a relevant fact for some other areas, emotionally, psychologically, morally, or whatever, but it's not relevant to the exact conclusion, to the exact argument being put forth. And there are subversions of this. So attacking a straw man, for instance, right? Again, that would be kind of a fallacy of relevance, because if you're attacking a straw man, then you're kind of making up a fictive or totally distorted position that, again, doesn't really immediately match up to the conclusion being argued for. So it's not a relevant position. But similar ones are also personal attacks or appeals to pity, right? I'm this terribly poor person, so I was absolutely unable to keep the deadline, and so on and so forth, right? That can be an emotionally convincing argument, but it's not always to the point, and so on and so forth. And then I had introduced kind of the opposite of that, and that's something that I think is really an important thing to strive towards, is the principle of charity. So try to make an argument that you're criticizing as strong as you can. And if you can still find a problem with it, well, then you have a really strong piece of writing, a really strong argument of your own. So actually it's in your own interest to make arguments that you're criticizing, positions that you're criticizing as strong as you can. That makes your job a little bit harder, but ultimately also makes you look better. Right? So also if you're reconstructing in an essay or something like that, an author's position, if you can make that author look even better and even clearer than they did themselves, that's what you're really aiming for. All right. So that was the one group of fallacies. We had looked at another group, question begging and circularity, which again are related to each other. Question begging is just appealing to a premise that is at least as questionable as the conclusion itself, or circularity is the special case where all or part of the conclusion is itself a premise offered in its own support, which means that the argument just plain goes in circles. So a really obvious and bad example would be something like this: abortion is intolerable and so must be prohibited. Well, that's just saying actually the same thing in slightly different terms. Can be a bit harder to spot, but if you find something like that, that's a big problem for the argument. We looked at these two. Again, I'm not going to go through them in great detail. This is more something useful that you might want to come back to in reviewing the slides or something like that. So squashed version is a false dilemma, falsely sets up an alternative or two alternatives and pretends that there would be no further possibilities, no further options. So it's actually ignoring relevant additional options and pretending that this choice is exclusive. Some of you confuse this in the tutorial exercises with the slippery slope, But the slippery slope doesn't really give you a choice between options. It's just saying if you go for the small, seemingly innocent, unimportant, if you take the first small step, then there's just impending doom. The apocalypse will follow, right? So it's not a choice, a limited choice between things, but just this very small change that is adopted that then just snowballs into something completely awful. So that's the slippery slope argument. And again, you can see both of these. You can have a good dilemma, right? It's really a matter of looking at the content. Same for the slippery slope. There can be versions of this that are actually good arguments. Last example, we looked at ambiguity and equivocation. And again, we can usefully lump or bring those together by saying an argument that involves an equivocation. And that's a very snazzy type of criticism. If you detect an equivocation somewhere, that's a nice way of maybe also practicing constructive criticism, right? Making a conceptual discovery by saying, but there are really two different words. There's the same word being used here, but there are really two different meanings behind it. Really cheap example would be something like this, right? There's a fine for parking, so parking is fine, so I parked there. That's a cheap version. That's not going to be a great conceptual discovery, but there could be more interesting cases where you're detecting a term like this that is ambiguous and is being used in two different senses in the same argument. Yeah? All right. And then we played around a little bit with this type of thing in the toots. So vague terms, terms that have clear applications in extreme cases, but unclear application in borderline cases. There's a huge problem about how to think about those terms. They're everywhere, but it's really hard to say whether they can even be sharply defined, and they give rise to these neat and fun and confusing kinds of paradoxes. So that just kind of can get you thinking about language and how it behaves. So here's what we'll be doing today. We'll be looking at a set of cognitive illusions and cognitive biases and seeing how they relate to each other. Then we'll be looking at one kind of theory in the background, dual process theory, system 1 and system 2 style reasoning, and how that might explain some of those cognitive illusions and cognitive biases. And then I'll be giving you a lot of kind of empirical examples. So this is just going to be a really eclectic, example-heavy lecture. Hopefully some new stuff and some interesting stuff in there as well. So this is a huge field and just kind of an idiosyncratic collection based on things I think are interesting. So here's one that probably everyone here knows. So that's really one of the best known illusions that are out there. It's very stable, the Müller-Lyer. So lower one, obviously longer than the upper arrow, and it's a very stable illusion. In terms of length, they're actually the same length, of course. But the interesting thing here is that even if you know that they are the same length, you still can't really think yourself out of the illusion, right? So it's that stable. You can't really, just knowing that it's not, that they're of equal length doesn't change what you're seeing here. So that's kind of the first type of distorting illusion that is commonly classed under the heading of cognitive illusions. And I'll get to what makes them cognitive later on, because so far we've just seen that they seem to be resistant to knowledge. Ambiguous illusions, again, just a really famous example. Probably everyone knows this, right? So again, you can see an old or a younger woman. Some of these are more, you can look at the internet, and some of those it's initially really hard to see the other option. But once you have, it suddenly becomes just obvious. And it also seems to be, there also seems to be an interesting effect where you can then switch between two interpretations. But it's very hard or almost impossible to see it as both the younger and the older woman at the same time, right? It's somehow some switching between two different interpretations that tends to be going on there. This is a mixture of them, right? The Necker cube, again, a really famous one, is itself ambiguous because you can change foreground to background, and again, that can be done more or less voluntarily, right? So which side of the cube you're seeing as in being in the front versus being in the back. But this is also a fictional case because the actual cube isn't even depicted, right? It's just kind of popping out because it's suggested by the white lines on the black circles. So sometimes we actually very clearly see or seem to see objects that aren't really there, right? You could do something similar with objects that are half occluded behind something or something like that. So there seems to be a natural filling in. Another cognitive illusion. And then we have these types of paradoxical ones where it just seems that there is no good interpretation to make sense of them, right? That's why they're fun. So there seems to be this endless circle of people moving upwards or downwards depending on how you see it, but it's just impossible that that could be the case. And Escher, of course, was the master of this. So that brings us to a more interesting question, and I'll go a bit more slowly later on because I have a bit probably lesser known examples later on. That's why I'm hurrying through this a bit. What is actually interesting about these cognitive illusions that we've now seen a number of examples of? Well, they seem to be saying in all of these cases what we're seeing is not really a property of the actual stimulus, right, of the actual object, visual object being presented to us. Rather, it seems to be a case that there's an interpretation. We're seeing something as something else, right, either as, so Wittgenstein's duck rabbit, either as a duck or as a rabbit. And again, there seems to be some switching going on here. How many people have seen the actual plush version in the NGV? Nobody. Very cool. If you go to the National Gallery, you can see, or at least a year ago, you could still see the huge plush version. It's about this big. You can walk around it and switch between duck and rabbit if you're so inclined. I was thrilled to see it. So, and what's happening here seems to be just expectation and interpretation, right? What do you expect to see? What do you already know you have seen before? What is the context? And so on and so forth. So here is a big quotation, Richard Gregory talking about Helmholtz. So this is a particular way of thinking about perception. And the idea in the background is that in all of these illusions, or that these illusions are just drawing our attention to a property of perception that is actually there all the time, right? And these cognitive illusions, we're being misled in some sense by a misapplication or an application of expectation, maybe hopes or fears or something like that, background knowledge that is more or less explicit, more or less implicit, that we might not even be aware of. But the idea is that this just becomes particularly obvious in these types of cases, but is actually always going on and is just less easy to detect in cases of unambiguous perception, right? So here Gregory is saying, well, we have perception as something like unconscious inference that we're doing based on whatever we're actually perceiving, but also based on contextual knowledge, based on past knowledge, and so on and so forth. So what we're actually doing is much like in science. We're projecting expectations or predictions into the world, and that is what we essentially, in the end, are actually going to be seeing. So seeing seems to be much more cognitive than you would have thought. It's not just passive, it's actually expectation that's doing the work. So if we go back to this, how would we make sense of something like this? What would maybe be an expectation or interpretation-based explanation of why this type of illusion occurs. Does anybody have an idea? Because that seems to be really low level and really stable, and it doesn't seem, or at least when I first thought about it, doesn't seem that that is a terribly good example of a cognitive illusion at all. That just seems to be really low level and immediate, and as we were saying, resists, is even resistant to knowing that they're actually the same length. So what might one want to, how might one explain that in expectation-based terms? Does anybody have an idea? Distance perception and expectations about distance is kind of a classical one. So consider this here. So here we just have it switched, right? And you can see the two angles. Those are your two arrows. Again, same length. Edges. And you can see that the one that seems to be longer is the one that would be farther away in that type of a corner, whereas the one that seems to be closer is the corner that is pointing towards you. Yeah? And that seems to be what that illusion is picking up on. So that's the carpentered world hypothesis. Yeah? So people who, so given that we live in a world full of those kinds of angles and edges, we have certain expectations about depth and distance and comparative length. And then even when we are presented with these arrows in just this abstract form, independently of actual physical objects, we still project these expectations, and that's why we see them as being of different length. So that's the idea in the background. And you would predict something from that. If you think back to the paper that I was talking about earlier, availability bias, the weirdest people in the world, right? Psychology being conducted mostly with psychology experiments being run mostly with psychology students, in Western rich industrialized countries. Well, the Müller-Lyer illusion is kind of a candidate for something that many people have thought is one of the most universal features almost of human perception, right? The idea being everybody has it. But then there are these studies that indicate that actually not everybody has it. It's just that the people being looked at in most of these studies have grown up in exactly that kind of environment. If you look at people from different cultures, so from hunter-gatherer societies that wouldn't have grown up in an environment with those kinds of edges in a carpentered world, then you would expect the illusion to disappear or to be much weaker, and that's actually what people find. So that seems to be kind of interesting, and that seems to indicate that we have some very basic expectations that are feeding into these seemingly universal illusions. Now here's another one. How many people know this one? Couple, but a lot of people don't. Does anybody want to explain how it works, or should I do that? So you can do this at home, right? If you have some realistic looking thing, something that looks like a hand, cleaning glove, yellow cleaning glove, or some weird kind of Halloween hand or something like that. You might not want to take the really gory, bloody ones because they might not work so well. Or a glove, something like that. So what you're going to do, I need two people, and you put your own hand in a position where you can't see it or the other person's hand. So it can be under a table, or it can be next, kind of on the same plane, but having some kind of cardboard thing or something like that. And then you put the fake hand, the rubber hand, in a position that is somewhat realistic, right? So that in a position that your own hand could be in, theoretically. And then the trick is to stroke synchronously, exactly at the same time, the fake hand and your real hand. So what happens now is that you're feeling the strokes, the touch. You can use a brush or a finger, or it doesn't really matter. You're feeling this in your own hand, and synchronously, exactly at the same time, you're feeling the stimulation. You're seeing the stimulation in the rubber hand. And what happens then very reliably in most people, it doesn't happen in me because I'm a terrible, terrible subject for everything. But if you're a relatively normal person, then very quickly people have the experience that the rubber hand is their hand. So some people will say that they actually feel a connection from their own shoulder to the rubber hand. And they'll also say that they can feel the touch that they're actually feeling, obviously, in their real hand, but they feel it there where they're seeing it. So they're feeling it in the rubber hand. And there are actually changes in brain activation that occur in concert with that as well. If you then ask people after the experiment to estimate where their actual hand was during the experiment, they're going to point, depending on how strong the illusion was, there's going to be something like drift. So if the illusion was strong, then they'll point more towards the direction of where the fake hand was. So that's kind of a measure that indicates that that's where they felt the touch to be, in the fake hand rather than in their real hand. You can also do scary things like pretending that you'll hit the rubber hand with a hammer, and then you can get, kind of very immediate reactions to this. So people do, in some sense, identify with that rubber hand, and there are also whole body versions of this experiment. So what does that tell us? Well, one thing it tells us is that what we experience as our bodies is again colored in some way by an expectation that we have. Namely, if two things are occurring synchronously, touch and sight, right? If those are occurring exactly at the same time, and the illusion doesn't work if you're doing this asynchronously, right? If it's not touch, felt and seen touch occurring in exact synchrony, then it doesn't work anymore. But if they are synchronized, then we expect them to be occurring on the same object. We don't expect there to be a situation where just as a matter of coincidence, felt and seen touch are occurring exactly at the same time. So when they do occur at the same time, we think that they must be occurring in the same body part, essentially, right? So that's one expectation. And another expectation seems to be that there's something like visual capture. So it's where I see it. It's not where I feel it. So the felt touch goes to where it's seen, namely to the rubber hand. Once you can do this, you can do weirder stuff, and this is stuff that is done in the philosophy department on the 6th floor. So you can start manipulating people. So once they're really into the illusion, you can start substituting things that don't look like hands, pieces of cardboard or something like that. Ogre hands have been tested, and so on and so forth. And you can also start using supernatural touch illusions. So what happens if you're no longer touching the rubber hand, but doing this, right? No longer causal contact. If people are really into it, they'll still say that they're feeling the touch in the rubber hand, even though they're no longer seeing it being physically touched. So you can start messing with participants in that way. And that again tells us something that once we have learned, in other words, once we're into the illusion, once we've learned that that rubber hand is ours, we might be prone to accept, to have expectations about what is happening in the experiment, and that might even lead us to have these kinds of supernatural touch illusions as well. Which is interesting because it kind of tells you something about how well or how solid our experience of our own bodies actually is. So you can try this at home. It's a fun thing to do. But back to cognitive biases and how that might relate to the stuff that we've been talking about here. Well, consider again kind of these two examples that you already know, right? Two invalid arguments. Both have the same structure, denying the antecedent. Both are invalid in exactly the same way, but it's harder to see in the example on the right-hand side. because here we have something, a conclusion that is just obviously true. So it's harder to see that the argument is invalid because it actually seems to be supporting something that we already want to accept. So we get something like an illusion of validity. And one thing to see here is that these illusions of validity now don't only affect reasoning, but they also can quite literally experience or infiltrate or influence what we see in the world or even what we experience as our bodies. So there seems to be some interesting connection going on there. So to move on a little bit, so what kinds of cognitive biases exist then? And I'm not going to talk through this in great detail. So there's a huge list of things. Some of those you already know, so some of those are going to affect decision making. My side bias, for instance, illusions of validity, hindsight bias, things seem more obvious in hindsight than before they actually happened. It seems that once you know how things turned out, you might think they had to turn out that way and not differently. Availability effects we already talked about. And some of those other ones I'll come back to later in the lecture. We have a lot of them happening, and I'll have examples of those for you later on as well in social interaction and social cognition. So in-group, out-group thinking, thinking you're somehow superior to others when this is an illusion, and so on and so forth. And another one is going to be memory, which kind of relates back to some of the memory effects that we were talking about in one of the earlier tutorials. So there's, and this is just a very short list. There are endless lists of this that you can look at and endless effects that you can look at if you're interested in that. So then the question is how does this actually work, or what is the type of theory that could be applied to that in the background? And I'm just going to talk you through one, very roughly through one possible theory of the types of cognitive processes that might be going on there in the background. So this is a famous theory, dual process theory, that basically says that we have two different systems involved in reasoning, broadly speaking. And the one is going to be an intuitive system, snap judgments, gut feelings, something like that. And the other is going to be a system that is more active in actually reasoning, critical thinking, carefully evaluating arguments, and that type of thing. So there's a contrast between how quickly they work. So the one, system one, the theory goes is fast, automatic, effortless. It just happens without your wanting to. You have very little control over it. It's just there, like in the illusions of validity or in the cognitive illusions that we were looking at. Whereas system two, reasoning, takes a lot more effort, is a lot slower, requires attention and concentration, and so is also prone to lapses in attention and concentration. It's more difficult to do. Seems to be conscious versus non-conscious, right? For the cognitive illusions and cognitive biases, they kind of kick in without your knowing that it's even happening. It might even seem to be objectively so that one arrow is longer than the other, or something like that. So you don't even realize that some kind of inferential process is at work there at all. It's just there, whereas system two reasoning, you're really thinking through something. You really notice that it's you doing the thinking. And related to this is that this system is always on, whereas the other is kind of just activated on demand when you need it, and otherwise it just kind of stays in the background and you don't use it. And then there are these two different styles of reasoning as well, so associative versus rule-based, detailed, attention to detail, attention to ways of actually, so everything that we've been doing here, what are the actual criteria for evaluating sources, evaluating the truth of premises and validity, and so on and so forth. All of that would go into system two, whereas kind of any rough and ready associative ad hoc intuitive gut feeling response would go into the system 1 style reasoning. Now, there are big debates here in the background. Well, there might also be evolutionary considerations, right? Who else has it, for instance? And there are big debates in the background as to what the relationship between those two systems is. So are there really two systems that are completely distinct, or they may be continuous and it's just some types of inference are more system 2-like and others are more system 1-like? So I don't think it's necessary to say that they're really sharply distinguished, right? But we can still see kind of two styles of reasoning nonetheless going on. And we can also begin to make sense of what learning might consist in, right? If you learn something at the beginning, you actually have to override those gut reactions and engage in this very slow, effortful, error-prone, conscious reasoning process. And then as you learn, you might slowly get better at it. So those types of skills might then get transferred into intuitive, faster responses as well. So that kind of seems to make sense of acquiring new skills and actually getting better at them. And if you have a highly learned skill, something like a language, right, a foreign language that you're learning, or something like that, then at some point it might just become second nature, and actually thinking about the rules might actually get you messed up again, right? So there can be effects like that as well. So normally the idea is going to be that those two systems actually cooperate with each other. They support each other, right? Because they you have kind of fast, kind of slapdash predictions or explanations going on, an attempt to maybe use incomplete information. So like in the fictional illusions that we looked at earlier, where the Necker cube wasn't really there, but you were still seeing it as present or something like that. So an attempt to maximize coherence, even if you're not given all of the facts. Kind of also a naive realist type of system, right? Just going with whatever you're presented with, as also maybe in the rubber hand illusion type things. Whereas system 2 would really be more responsible for monitoring the outputs of system 1. Is this really a good assumption to accept? Should I be, or do I need to actually go through some work here and be more critical? Do I really want to explicitly endorse this belief? And so on and so forth. So that would be the idea behind it. And you can see that they would work together, but you can also see that you could get into trouble either if this one is not very practiced and gets messed up, or if this one of kind of associative and naive conclusions, jumping to conclusions, were to override cases where we would actually need critical evaluation and assessment. So in those cases, we could get conflict. Can I have a volunteer for something at this point? Very simple. Somebody who doesn't already know this. Just need somebody. Cool. Good. So you're on now for a while. So that's not bad. So right now, just name as quickly as you can the ink color starting up here, moving through those lines of the squares.
Red, yellow, blue, white, black, purple, brown, yellow,
Yeah, well, good. So that's fairly easy, right? We're just naming colors. So now you're going to do the very same thing. And maybe you can just do the first 2 lines. That's probably enough. And you're going to concentrate on the ink color, but try to not read out the word. And again, do this as fast as you can.
red, green, blue, yellow, pink, orange, blue, green, blue, white.
Yeah. So again, not very hard, right? Kind of obvious to do that. Seems easier now that the word is there, though of course you were concentrating purely on the ink color. Now you're going to do it again. Just ink color, ignore the word, doesn't matter.
Ink color.
Yeah.
Green, Yellow, green, blue.
Not so easy anymore. You started out really well, but then it got harder. Wait a minute. Did that change? Yeah. Last one, now you just read out the words, ignore the ink color.
Red, green, blue, yellow, pink, orange, blue, green, blue, white.
So you can read. That's good, right? So that seems to be really easy again. Thank you. So obviously this was a terrible experiment because we would need reaction times. But I think even here, you can kind of see what's going on there in the background, right? And I think your answers nicely illustrated the point behind this. So there's three standard findings. First finding is semantic interference. So it's actually, if you have the case up there, right-hand side, it's an incongruent condition, right, where the ink color is not congruent with the semantic information. So red, the word red is actually in a green color. And doing that is actually slower than just naming neutral stimuli, right? That slows, so that incongruence slows the reaction time down. You have the same effect for congruent stimuli, semantic facilitation. So if it's like this, everything is the way it should be, then people actually get faster than if they were just naming. So reading it helps, even if that's not what you're doing. They actually get faster than when looking at the neutral stimuli. And both of those effects disappear when we start reading the word rather than concentrating on the ink color. Why is this happening? Well, it's happening because reading, again, a highly learned task, right? And it's extremely hard to concentrate on the ink color rather than the word when that's what we're presented with, right? We just naturally kind of try to read that out. And I don't know if you felt that, but when I try to do this, it's kind of like actively not reading the word. You really have to try and stop yourself from doing that because that just seems to be the natural thing that you would jump to. Another thing here, so there are some very cool follow-up experiments with this that then we'll look at what happens in people with synesthesia, for instance, right? So people that actually see certain words or numbers or letters as having a certain color. And you find very similar effects with them for their synesthetic experiences. So there's very cool stuff there in the background as well. But everybody clear on this? So here it seems almost impossible to actually bracket the semantic information. Why is that the case? Because in the congruent case, we have the two systems cooperating, right? And then exactly we get conflict when we have to try to bracket consciously our automatically learned response. So that seems to be the thing there in the background. Other examples. So this is one, again, very, very familiar. Priming, I think we've even talked about it a little bit here. So if you have associative activation, right, you immediately fill in something that will be fitting to that just based on prior knowledge and on the information already given. So this is a typical system one style maximizing coherence type of reaction. And this would also work in cases like this where you could actually fill in different words just given those letters. And here it's almost always going to be soap. There it's almost always going to be soup, just based on background information that people are given. And you can do interesting things with this. So far this is just fairly basic. Who really cares about filling in words? This is probably also in part the mechanism that we use, right, when we're actually disambiguating between different readings of the same word. bank, bank, fine, fine, and so on and so forth. Consider this type of thing. Do people know this? So this was one study that looked at what would happen if you put this type of poster, cycle thieves, we are watching, Big Brother, we are watching, or something, next to a bicycle, what do you call it, bicycle parking lot or something, where people left their bicycles at a university. And then they compared how many bikes got stolen before and after the poster was put up. And it's important to see this didn't mean that cameras were put up, right? This was just a poster with eyes watching, right? Somebody checking your behavior. And bicycle thefts actually went down. So it's not entirely clear. I mean, this is just one type of example. It's not entirely clear that this is really kind of associative, immediate gut reaction, priming type behavior that's going on there, right? It could be that potential bike thieves were also thinking this through. That's not known, of course. You know, maybe I shouldn't steal here because if they have a poster, maybe they're actually doing something. Not completely clear. But it could also be that this is just a very simple way to very subtly influence what people are going to do or not going to do. Just kind of creating a sense of, this might not be a good place to steal a bike. And then you can also ask further questions. So how much can you manipulate yourself by putting certain subtle clues in different places, right? Independently of what you consciously think about them, that might be a very subtle way to influence maybe even your own or other people's behavior. So that's one area where that could be interesting. You can also think of other cases, right? So something like deities, gods, watching over you, right, traditionally. How do you behave if you think that somebody knows everything that you're doing? Santa Claus knows everything that you did all year, so you might be better or something like that, right? There could be similar effects for something like this. Here's an example that brings us closer to something like that, and where we're getting into the area of how this influences not just behavior, but maybe also reasoning. So the intelligent design wars, especially in the US, right? What is the better theory? Is it evolution or is it intelligent design? And why do people really believe what they believe? And this was a study that tried to link preference for these types of two different types of theories to existential angst, right? Awareness of your own mortality. So what they did was confront people with texts, I believe it was in this case, drawing attention to existential threats to their own mortality, to impending death or something like that, and investigated whether being confronted with those kinds of situations, you could also, I think other studies have used not texts, but maybe pictures of death, pictures of coffins or cemeteries or something like that. And if people are confronted with those kinds of cues, they tend to be more prone to accept these kinds of theories, right? So then suddenly if you're confronted, or if those kinds of fears are awakened in you, suddenly people become more willing to accept something like intelligent design over something like evolution. And this is seen, I think, independently of what they started out believing in the first place. So kind of a very very strong effect, but it can also be reversed. So they also give us in the abstract this little bit of hope, right, for rationality by saying it can be reversed. If you teach participants that naturalism can be a source of existential meaning or something like that, then those effects can again be overwritten. So sometimes kind of very basic fears in other words, might prime what types of theories we actually find attractive, and the reasons that we do so might have very little to do with the actual theoretical background and reasons being offered in defense. That might just be kind of a gut reaction as to what is more attractive. So terror management theory in the background, right? Maybe we're adapting, or people are adopting theories because that's just a way of managing fears that we all have. So that would be kind of a stronger area where this might actually mess with critical thinking abilities. Last couple of minutes, questions on that so far? So as I said, this is just a very hurried tour through an exhibit of examples that I take to be interesting. So a couple last examples. Cognitive biases. Some of those you already know. So this one, very stable effect, conjunction effect. Take a person, Linda, 31, single, outspoken, former philosophy major, concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, participated in demos and so on and so forth. Is it more probable that she's now a bank teller, or that she's a bank teller and active in the feminist movement? This is a lecture about cognitive biases, so you're probably not making that mistake. But most people are going to think that 2 is actually more likely. But that can't be correct, right? Because we just know nothing about what she is doing right now, but 2 events occurring together are always less probable, but certainly not more probable than just one of those events occurring on their own. And what's happening, we're just being primed intuitively by what we know about her. She has this background that doesn't seem to fit being a bank teller, but it fits being active in the feminist movement. So that's what we go for very quickly and very intuitively. We just associate those 2 things, and that leads us to the wrong conclusion. So again, just kind of answering the easiest question, jumping to a conclusion as quickly as you can using rule of thumb style ad hoc reasoning that is characteristic of System 1. And that type of conflict explains a lot of the other biases that we've been talking about, right? So we talked about this one as well, availability effects, right? So confusing or thinking that the right answer is just the one where you can more easily find examples, right? And that doesn't always follow. So we've talked about that one as well. We can consider framing effects. We talked about that a little bit in an earlier lecture. Here I just want to draw attention to the bottom one, right? Depending on how information is presented, people get misled. Again, why? Because that's intuitive style associative reasoning kicking in. And the weird thing about this type of lower example is that you will even find this from experts or professionals that should know better, but they're still misled, and they might even try to justify their wrong answer once they've endorsed it. Superiority illusions, the better than average effect. Almost everybody thinks that they're better looking, friendlier, more competent, more motivated, nicer, and all good things than most other people, right? And that obviously can't be true for everyone. But it's also more basic than that. So it's about, obviously I'm a better philosopher than most others, and teacher, and whatever. But those are assessments, but it also goes to lower level things. So you'd think you knew what you looked like, right? Kind of probably look at yourself several times every day in the mirror. We also all know that photographs never capture what we actually look like. That's not me. That's just a terrible photograph. Well, here was a study that used morphed versions of photographs. So the actual one is in the middle, and then they were made a bit more attractive or a bit less attractive by making facial features more or less symmetrical. And then researchers investigated how quickly or how well people could actually identify their actual photograph as compared to the morphed ones. You can already kind of expect the answer. So the better looking enhanced picture is the one more likely to be identified as one's own. And this is also reaction times. So again, a robust measure. People are much quicker to identify the better looking version than the real or bad looking version of themselves. And the same effect happens for the people that we love. So we actually see our loved ones as better looking than they actually are. And this could be a nice thing in a way. You know, this might be the type of illusion that you really want to have. Right? So I'm not getting older from year to year. Students are getting younger and so on and so forth. Right? So we actually see ourselves very robustly as better than we are. Can I give you two last examples and then I'll be done, because I think these are interesting ones and potentially not as pleasant ones as seeing yourself as more attractive. In and out group behavior. So here you have a participant in a scanner. 3 options. Participant is going to see another person receiving extreme pain and now has 3 choices what to do. You can take half of the other person's pain. You can watch a soccer game while you know that the other person will be getting all of the pain and you're just doing something else. Or you can go for the really kind of confrontational one. The other person is receiving the pain. Obviously this isn't happening, but that's what the participant is told, but you're going to watch. And how do people react? Well, what they choose strongly depends on whether the other person is perceived as in or out group. And I think this might have been soccer team fans or something like that, but you can think that that refers not just to soccer teams, but to nationalities, races, and so on and so forth. So you help the people that are in your own perceived group, and you watch people suffering when they're perceived as out group. So there's a lot in the neuroscience of empathy that is going on here. Last example, you get the same thing actually on very low-level areas of brain processing as well. So this is racial bias. So it's well known that we're quicker at identifying, at recognizing people who are, same race, familiar race, as ours. But here, I don't know if you can see that. You have 2. So this was, again, a situation, same racial group, different racial group to the participant. And then neutral stimulus, cotton swab on the cheek, that doesn't hurt. And painful stimulus, kind of a syringe or something sharp, painful looking on the cheek. And participants, so kind of the empathic responses, so brain processing for pain and observed pain was strongest, again, for the painful stimulus over the neutral one, and stronger for in-group, same race than other race. And so that, and I'm not sure how that corresponded to how racist people thought they were, but those are things that can be going on in the background independently, to some extent, of the conscious positions that we actually take. So those might be really low level, right? Things driving behavior and beliefs. Maybe being aware of them as a way to get them under control. So that's it for now. I'm not going to go through that. We're going to be looking at a sample exam in the toots. I'd like you to do something. Take a few minutes if you have the time. We've all heard about sample bias. So don't make it a biased sample. Please do the situ evaluations. And aside from that, I hope you enjoyed this. I have, and I'll see you in the toots. Thanks.